Good day, everyone.
Hello.
Everybody having fun?
Yeah.
I was really impressed by the whole conference. My name is Keith Akers, and I've been an activist for 30 years. I've been a vegan for 30 years, and I've been very active in various groups. You probably haven't heard of me, but that's because you don't live in Washington, D.C. or in Denver, Colorado. I was very much involved in the Vegetarian Society of D.C., where I was president, and I was also involved in the Vegetarian Society of Colorado, where I was also president, but at a different time. And I've also served as an officer in the International Vegetarian Union from 1987 until 1993. So I want to talk to you on the topic Vegetarianism and Christianity, why don't they mix? And this is going to prompt a number of questions in people's minds. First question is, why do we even care? And that's a question which I hope to convince you of the importance of. I think that we need to understand why this is an important subject in the first place. Why do we care about vegetarianism? Why do we care about Christianity? Why do we care about the fact that they don't mix? And the second question is, what do you mean they don't mix? Because people say, what about the Seventh-day Adventists? What about the Christians in the early church? There are vegetarians who are Christians today. What do you mean they don't mix? So I want to explain what I mean by the statement, they don't mix. And I'm referring to institutional Christianity and not to the religion of Jesus, which I believe is somewhat different. And then the third question I want to address is, what can we do about it? So to begin with, why do we care? Well, first of all, obviously, I care about this subject, and I'd like to give you a brief history of my involvement in this whole area and why I personally care, and then why we should care, even if you've never met me. I became interested in the question of whether Jesus was a vegetarian very early on. I became a vegetarian in 1978. I became a vegan in 1980, and one of the first things I did was start to write a book on the subject, because I thought at that time there weren't enough books on vegetarianism or veganism. Now today, you'd laugh at that, but in 1980, it wasn't that strange. It wasn't that strange an idea. This was before John Robbins. This was before a whole bunch of other authors that are now, basically all the authors in the auditorium. John McDougall actually published a book, the McDougall Plan, in the same year and almost the same day that I put out a vegetarian source book. And this is my book. It's the book for which I am best known, even though it's very old. It's almost 30 years old now. But it covers the nutrition, ecology, and ethics of a natural foods diet. And if you want a copy, I can give you one. Now, one of the questions in the book which I considered was Jesus a vegetarian? What about Christianity and vegetarianism? And this was just one chapter in my book. But at that time, I realized that whether Jesus was a vegetarian was an important subject, because if you don't think that Jesus was a vegetarian, then that creates a problem with your basic beliefs. Because then you can't say that it's wrong to eat meat. If Jesus was not a vegetarian, then if you say, well, it's wrong to eat meat, or you shouldn't eat meat, then you're condemning Jesus himself. You're saying, I can figure out something that Jesus couldn't. And this is a problem for many vegetarians. Not all vegetarians, but many vegetarians. Because if you look at the vegetarian movement, you will see that the vegetarian movement, there's very much interest in what I would call the ethical reason for being vegetarian. And by ethical reason, I don't mean that whether you're ethical or not, but that you don't eat meat because you believe that it is wrong to unnecessarily kill animals at all, and to kill animals for food is not necessary. So why should we do it? Why should we eat meat? If you go to any vegetarian conference, such as this one, or any vegetarian potluck, any vegan potluck, you'll immediately see that everyone's interested in this issue. They just take it for granted. No one questions this. Maybe the newcomers might say, well, I'm not sure about eating animals. It bothers me a bit, but I'm not sure. And so you might want to talk to them. But the people that are the regulars, the people that are interested in the vegetarian and vegan movement, they take this for granted, that it's wrong to eat animals for food. So already you can begin to see sort of where I'm going with this. And I'll give you an example of my own involvement in the church and with vegetarianism. I was raised as a Christian, and after I became a vegetarian, I started investigating this question, as I previously stated. And I would go to church, and my most recent experience with church was a church that was pretty liberal. I'm pretty liberal theologically. I don't base my Christianity, I don't base my religion on the Bible. I think that there are things in the Bible that were not true. I know that some people whom I greatly respect disagree with me, but that's fine. I'm following the religion of Jesus. I'm not following necessarily a book or anything like that, or a set of doctrines. In fact, I think it's wrong to identify Christianity with doctrines in the first place. I think this is where Christianity started to go wrong in the 4th century with Constantine, the Council of Nicaea, and these sorts of things. So I go to church, and I like it. It's liberal theologically. It's a welcoming church. I get along with the people. I like the preacher. So in fact, it's a Methodist. It's probably the most far-out Methodist church in the country, in Denver, Colorado, or one of the furthest out. I think it would rival anything here. Anyway, so I like the church, but the problem is I have some problems. First of all, is they want me to tithe. And I think that's reasonable. I think that churches need to be supported. How are you going to run the church if you just show up and nobody supports it? So that's not a good thing. So I'm sympathetic with that. But then if I'm giving, whatever I'm giving, $10 a week or whatever, then, this adds up. Am I giving that much to the vegetarian movement? The vegan cause? Well, actually, at one point I did when I was young and a little wealthier. When I had a good job as a computer programmer, I'd write out the big checks and send it off to whoever, to PETA or to Vegetarian Resource Group or whatever. And but you think about that. You think about how much am I devoting my life to vegetarianism and how much am I devoting my life to the church. And then you have the problem of meals. Every time they have a meal, you have a problem because you've got to make sure that they understand that you're a vegan. Now, in this particular church, it was a small church. There were maybe 50 people that would show up in church on Sunday, and I was one of about 4 vegetarians, and there was one other vegan. There was one vegan, 2 other vegetarians, and one person that was almost vegan but was not quite. So I was not totally lonely in this church, but every time we had a meal, it's like, oh, you can eat this. So every time we have meals, that it's a problem. And there's also a problem with fundamental values, that I have to realize that these people, even though they're very nice, they don't accept my fundamental values, because this is important to me. This is I've given many years of my life and hours of work to work on this, and they don't basically care. And then you finally have things like Heifer International. This church, even though it was a very nice church, they supported Heifer International, and that basically I said, that's it, I'm out of here. So it's a nice church. I like them. I still am on I'm still friends with many of them, but I can't justify going to such a church myself, and I can't justify sending someone else there. So if I can't conscientiously say, yes, you can make it in this church as a vegetarian or a vegan. I just can't. So that's sort of where I'm coming from, and that's a problem. So why should we care about this? Because there are people that care about it, certainly such as myself, but there's some other reasons too. Christianity is the dominant religion in our culture. About 3/4 of the public, of the American public, the United States, is Christian. That's actually a little less than it was. Maybe 20 years ago, it was maybe 85%. But still, it's a lot. And so if vegetarianism, vegans are about 2 to 3% of the population, according to the Vegetarian Resource Group. And so 75%, well, the church basically is in retreat right now. Their membership is shrinking. Vegetarians are expanding. Veganism is expanding. So it's a very different dynamic in these kinds. But obviously, at some point, they're going to have to interact. At some point, we're going to have to deal with them. And when we address fundamental questions in our culture, people usually turn to their religion. Even if they don't go to church, when they ask themselves questions about, well, why are we here on the planet? What should we be doing with our lives? Questions like that, you think of your religion, whatever it is. And so this is how we address fundamental questions. And today, there's a very important reason why we should be addressing fundamental questions, and that's the environmental crisis. I'm sure that many of you have heard about this, about climate change, resource depletion, peak oil. It's extremely serious, and this is going to come before the entire public. This is not something that just our little groups are going to address, or even our nation will have to address. The whole species will have to address this topic. James Hansen has said that if we produce and consume all the fossil fuels that we are capable of, if we mine all the coal, drill all the oil, extract all the tar sands and the natural gas that we can, using all the fracking and so forth that we can, then a runaway greenhouse effect is not only possible but likely. And what a runaway greenhouse effect would mean would that over a period of perhaps a century or two, that the atmosphere would take off, it would adopt dynamics of its own, and all life on Earth would be eliminated because it would become too hot. It would be like the oceans would basically evaporate, and it would create a situation climatically like the planet Venus. This could happen. And there's also another problem that is probably even more important, and that is the question of resource depletion and peak oil. How many of you have heard of the expression peak oil? Okay. Oh, that's great. That's great. Okay, so about a number of people have heard of it. Well, vegetarians meet peak oil. It's really the defining issue, even though perhaps only one person in 100 in the general public has heard of this. It's probably the defining issue of the 21st century, possibly of any other century as well. What peak oil refers to is the maximum point of world oil production. We know that oil is a finite resource. It's not about running out. It doesn't mean that after you pass the peak of world oil production that it's all gone. What actually will happen is that you will have a gradual rise of oil production, and then at some point it will reach geological limits, and then oil will be harder and harder to extract, and you'll see a decline. It will be very expensive, and it will start to decline. Well, what's been happening lately with the price of oil? It's been going up. In the late 1990s, oil was like $12, $14 a barrel. Today, I haven't checked it recently, but it's like $95, $100 a barrel just for the United States, and somewhat higher for overseas. Brent crude, I think, is the standard for world oil supplies. So it's gone up dramatically, 5-10 times just in the past decade. And despite this, oil production is not increasing. Oil production for 150 years since Colonel Drake drilled his well in Titusville, Pennsylvania, oil production has been steadily increasing with some ups and downs, but basically steadily increasing until 2005. And in 2005, what happened is that it stopped increasing. And since then, it's been oscillating a very narrow range, going up 0.5%, down 0.5%, in that range. So we've really, despite record oil prices, we just can't drill anymore, and we're doing everything we can. We're fracking, we're using tar sands, we're using everything we can, and still we can't really increase oil production. And at some point, I think pretty soon, perhaps within 5 years, it's going to actually start declining. So peak oil, for all intents and purposes, is here today. What does that mean for us? The economy runs on oil. An economy that is not growing is an economy that's going to go into a recession or a depression. That's what we found out in 2008 when oil prices went up to $147 a barrel. And then what happened? The economy crashed. This is a symptom of what we call the limits to growth. There was a book that was written about that, called Limits to Growth in 1972, and essentially we're seeing that happen today. So that means that all this debt that we've run up, all the government debt and the private debt, is actually much greater in the United States. The credit cards, the mortgages, the business loans, all those kinds of things are actually substantially more than the government debt. So there's a lot of debt. How are you going to pay it off? How are you going to pay it off in a shrinking economy? You won't. So you're going to have serious economic problems. These problems that we first saw in 2008 are just going to repeat. Our society is going to have to come to terms with this, that we cannot grow. That we cannot grow the economy. We're going to have to get used to living on less. And so this is going to dominate the whole political scene, I think, for the rest of the century. I don't see any way around it. People will wag their fingers. They'll say, oh, it's those Arabs, or oh, it's the Republicans, or it's the government, or it's the corporations. They'll try to point their fingers at different things, but the reality is there's just not that much to go around, and we've got to figure out how to divide it up and how to make the best of the world in which we have to live with less. This is all coming to head. So what this means is that we've got to address fundamental values questions. Okay, the first thing that we need to do is think about veganism. Don't think that veganism is not connected with all of this. There was an article in World Watch magazine, I believe in 2009, that stated that livestock agriculture contributed about 51% of all greenhouse gas emissions. That actually the earlier study that had been done somewhat earlier by the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, that study only showed 18%. But what Robert Goodland and Jeff Anhang showed in their article was that a number of greenhouse gas emissions, both methane and carbon dioxide, were not being counted or were being misallocated. And it was actually substantially more. Our problems with the climate are to a great extent a land use problem, that we don't have forests, instead we have pastures. And we have zillions of cows that are producing record amounts of methane. And no one is thinking about how to do this. So we've got to deal with fundamental values. Sooner or later, veganism and Christianity are going to have to deal with each other. Because I think that veganism is going to take off. Christianity is going to have to come to grips with this also. And where is Christianity in all of this? What does Christianity say about simple living? What does Christianity say about veganism? What does Christianity say about pretty much anything that's socially relevant? Well, there are Christians that are talking about this, to their credit. There are even conservative Christians who are talking about this. But by and large, it's not being addressed. So we have to address it. We've got the opportunity. Something needs to be said. Something needs to be done. Now, you might say, well, Christianity and vegetarianism might mix. And I'll, first of all, try to make the case that they could and do mix. First of all, there were many early Christians who were vegetarian. Basil the Great was a vegetarian. Jerome, who was a saint in the Catholic Church, was vegetarian. Clement of Alexandria, Tertullian, Origen was vegetarian. There were many famous vegetarians in the early church. In fact, vegetarians in the early church almost reads like a who's who in early Christianity. According to Eusebius, James, the brother of Jesus, was a vegetarian, and all the disciples were vegetarian. Was Jesus a vegetarian? Yes, I think that Jesus was a vegetarian, but you've got these problems because the Bible says that Jesus fed fish to the 5,000, that Jesus ate fish on one occasion, that he ate the Passover. Well, I could in fact spend an entire talk just on looking at these Bible passages that talk about Jesus and fish. And I could talk about, well, the fact that fish, actually, the word fish in Greek, ichthus, is actually an acronym, which means Jesus Christ, Son of God, Savior. There's a lot of reasons for believing that historically these references to fish are very weak. In fact, if you look at other writers, Irenaeus, for example, who's from the 2nd century, Arnobius, and Eusebius, all refer to the cases of Jesus feeding fish to the 4,000 or to the 5,000. But they only mention bread. They say Jesus miraculously distributed bread, but they don't say fish. They just say bread. So I suspect that the original story was bread and that fish was added on. So from a historical reason, all of these passages are very weak. But I don't need to discuss that, but I will just throw that out in case anyone is interested, and show that in any event, there's very strong reasons for connecting vegetarianism to early Christianity. If you look at modern Christianity, there are many Christians who are vegetarian. For example, the Seventh-day Adventists are vegetarian. George Malcolmus has his Hallelujah diet. And now Saddleback Ministries, which is a conservative theological group, is starting what they call their Daniel plan. And they're referring, of course, to the case of Daniel in the Old Testament, who refused the king's meat and wanted vegetables only. And so they're trying to promote what is essentially a vegan diet. And so you could say, yes, that's very good. And in fact, if you go back to the history of the vegetarian movement was founded by Christians to a certain extent. Modern vegetarian movement is a Christian idea because the Bible Christian Church existed in England and in America. And in England, the members of the Bible Christian Church were instrumental in getting the Vegetarian Society of what is now the Vegetarian Society of the UK, which then I think was just called the Vegetarian Society. They were instrumental in getting it started. And then the same Bible Christian Church in America also started the first vegetarian group in America in 1850. So you see that in 1847 and 1850 already Christians are actually starting a vegetarian movement. And you've got the Seventh-day Adventists today. Well, unfortunately, when you unpack this, you see that there's problems all along the way. These modern Christians are only interested in vegetarianism, or mostly interested in vegetarianism for health reasons, or perhaps because they're against the excesses of factory farming. But there's nothing wrong with eating meat per se. They're going back to their belief that Jesus was not a vegetarian. That's the problem. That's the problem. And that's, if you understand that point, you see why vegetarianism and Christianity might not mix, that there's actually a problem here. And Rachel McNair, who's a social psychologist, actually did a study on vegetarians. Your question?
Yeah, you said that this is why it can't mix.
Yeah.
Isn't that up to the individual to decide?
It's certainly. The question is, isn't this up for the individual to decide? And the question is yes. The answer is basically yes, sure, no problem. I don't have a problem with that. I'm just showing why there may be problems, and maybe we could wait until there will be a time at the end to answer questions. Rachel McNair, who's a social psychologist, did a survey of vegetarianism in religion, and what she did was she sent out a survey to people on an online vegetarian cruise. And she sent out a similar survey just online, just recruiting people randomly. And the results looked pretty good. It wasn't real scientific, but the results looked pretty good. And the most popular religion among vegetarians is?
Buddhism.
Any more guesses?
Christianity. I don't know.
Guess it. Okay, you will probably not get it because it's undefined spirituality. Undefined spirituality? I didn't even know that was a religion. Well, there's an explanation for this. When Rachel set up the tests, she had all these religions listed. She had Christianity, Buddhism, Judaism, all the other religions, and the atheists and agnostics, and then down at the bottom, undefined spirituality. And her thought was that people that didn't identify with any of these other religions could check, but still felt that they were religious in some sense, even though they weren't. They weren't atheists or agnostics, but they were religious, but they didn't identify with any of these other religions. They could check off undefined spirituality. It was a throwaway category, but this throwaway category came in first. 27% of all vegetarians identified with undefined spirituality. Christianity was in second, with 26%. Third place went to atheists and agnostics with 21%. All the other religions, Judaism, Buddhism, Hinduism, this is in the United States. They got a smattering of percentages from 3%, 4%, 7% along those lines. It was pretty evenly divided out among all other religions. So you see what the problem is and why I say that this is a problem which, regardless of our personal beliefs, we need to address in some way, and that is that a majority of vegetarians, an overwhelming majority of vegetarians reject Christianity. Overwhelming majority of Americans accept Christianity. Could this be a problem? Basically, yes, it can be a problem. It can be a problem. And that's why I am very concerned about this. So I want to ask the question, why don't they mix? Why don't we see some sort of synchronicity between the vegetarian movement and the rest of the population over questions of religion? And I think the ultimate explanation, this is a huge topic, and I could go on for hours, but the basic answer is that it goes back to a dispute in the early church over vegetarianism and animal sacrifice. And this is in the very earliest documents of Christianity. And this is not like from some channeled teaching. This is right out of the New Testament. And I'm going to read to you from Romans. This is Romans chapter 14.
What version are you reading?
I'm reading from the Revised Standard. But there's no significant difference between the different versions on this. It's all about the same. You get some minor differences. As for the man who is weak in faith, welcome him, but not for disputes over opinions. One believes he may eat anything, while the weak man eats only vegetables. Let not him who eats, that is, he who eats meat, despise him who abstains, And let not him who abstains pass judgment on him who eats.
What passage was that?
This is Romans 14. I'm going to read from various verses in that, but you'll find it if you look at Romans 14. Then let us no more pass judgment on one another, but rather decide never to put a stumbling block or hindrance in the way of a brother. If your brother is being injured by what you eat, then you are no longer walking in love. Do not let what you eat cause the ruin of one for whom Christ died. Do not, for the sake of food, destroy the work of God. Everything is indeed clean, but it is wrong for anyone to make others fall by what he eats. It is right not to eat meat or drink wine or do anything that makes your brother stumble. And that last phrase, you see the whole problem. Don't make your brother stumble. These are not other pagan vegetarians or other Jewish but non-believing vegetarians. These are other Christian vegetarians that believe not only that they should be vegetarian, but that vegetarianism should be required. Otherwise, this whole passage in Paul doesn't make any sense. And it's not the only place in the letters of Paul where he talks about this. He also talks about these kinds of food issues in 1 Corinthians 8 through 10 and Galatians 2, where he talks about a big split in the early church. In 1 Corinthians 10:25, Paul says, "Eat whatever is sold in the meat market without raising any question on the ground of conscience. If one of the unbelievers invites you to dinner and you are disposed to go, eat whatever is set before you without raising any question on the ground of conscience. But if one says to you, 'This has been offered in sacrifice,' then out of consideration for the man who informed you and for conscience sake, I mean his conscience sake, not yours, do not eat it." So what Paul in all of these passages is saying several things. The main thing he's saying is don't offend these vegetarians. There are apparently people that you do not want to offend in the early church. And he doesn't want to do it, I think, out of love and also just as a practical reason. He doesn't because they're very much entrenched in the church. And also there's another question here, which is the question of animal sacrifice. In that passage, Paul referred to animal sacrifice. And in 1 Corinthians 8 through 10, he's actually addressing the question of whether we should eat meat offered to pagan idols in sacrifice. And meat is sort of discussed as a special case of that because much of the meat that was eaten by the common people was that eaten in animal sacrifices. Most people in ancient times were vegans out of necessity. And they were vegans, not only were they vegans, they were probably eating a pretty bad vegan diet. They were eating wheat, for example, and maybe occasionally they would get the addition of lentils or herbs or olives. And this was their diet, so we can imagine that nutritional deficiencies were probably rampant in the ancient world. The only time you would get meat, if you were among about probably 95%, 99% of the population, would be if you were in the upper class. If you were rich, you could afford meat. Otherwise, you were only likely to get it at a festival, like when a sacrifice was offered to a pagan god, if you were living in the Roman world, or if you were at Passover and you were Jewish, you might get some of the Passover lamb. But most of the time, only the rich, only the very rich, would eat meat or fish, either. Fish in some areas was even rarer than meat. It was even more difficult to get than meat. So that's why animal sacrifice, which isn't an issue for us today at all, because, I mean, who sacrifices animals? Nobody, basically. Well, maybe some people around, very minor groups might sacrifice animals, but it's not a big issue. But in that day, it was a big issue. And Paul is saying, eat whatever is offered, whatever is sold in the meat market. Usually it was sacrificed to pagan idols without raising questions of conscience. And this was a hot-button issue in the church. In Acts, in fact, you see the exact opposite advice being given. James says that one of the four key things that you cannot do, that Gentile converts to Christianity must not do, is eat meat offered to pagan idols. This is one, so directly contradicting Paul. And also there's some passages in Revelation where it says these churches have gone astray because they are not prohibiting meat offered to pagan idols. So we see in the ancient church there was a big issue over animal sacrifice and meat consumption more generally. And this split the church. Because you see Paul and the churches he preached to, namely the Gentile churches, because he was the first person to take, we would believe he was the first person to take the message of Christianity to the Gentiles as opposed to Jews. And on the other hand, you have Jewish Christianity, James, the brother of Jesus, John, and Peter, all on the other side. And there's a big split between the Jerusalem church and Paul over this issue because we read about it in Galatians. And Paul evidently stopped speaking to Peter because he denounced Peter to his face. That's what he says in Galatians. And he's very angry, and he makes a lot of actually pretty crude comments about the Jewish Christians, perhaps asking why don't they castrate themselves, and a few other things. So it's a very disturbing kind of dispute in the early church. And essentially, you have a split between Jewish Christianity and Gentile Christianity, which actually, it's ironic because it does not have to do with the issues that we think of. It doesn't have to do with, for example, male circumcision. Paul, in fact, in Galatians says that Titus was not required to be circumcised. So circumcision apparently is something optional, if we can believe what Paul says. But animal sacrifice is a much touchier, much more controversial problem. So, well, what happened? Long story short, the vegetarian faction in the early church lost. Why did they lose? Well, first of all, they lost because Paul is a very persuasive letter writer. I don't necessarily agree with Paul on everything. For example, probably not on this issue, although I would agree with him on other issues perhaps, but not on this issue. But he is a good writer, and I think he's also a good historical source of information about the early church, much better actually than the Gospels. And that's why we should go to Paul first if we want to have an idea of what life in the early church was about, and only secondly, look at the Gospels and see if we can explain the Gospels in terms of the dynamics of the history of the early church. But there's another reason which is actually even more important, and that is the Jewish revolt against Rome. Jesus died probably in the year 30, and this controversy with Paul and Peter and James, which Paul talks about, probably took place in the year 54, if we can look at the dating that's set up from various sources. And then in 62, James, the brother of Jesus, is killed. In the year 66, there's a great revolt against Rome that breaks out. Rome was dominating all of Judea at that time, and the people rose up in revolt. It was very bloody, and eventually, of course, the revolt was put down. And hundreds of thousands of people were killed. The standard way of practicing warfare in those days were if you besieged a city and it didn't surrender and you captured it, then all the inhabitants were slaughtered, men, women, and children. If you were lucky, you might get sold into slavery. That's what warfare was like. Hundreds of thousands of people, perhaps more, perhaps millions of people were killed in that war. It was very traumatic to the Jewish world. And the Jewish Christians were affected just because all Jews were affected. Gentile Christianity, however, was almost completely untouched. So the Gentile churches are left in place. They continue to expand. We almost don't hear from Jewish Christianity at all after the year 70. In 70, the Romans captured Jerusalem and the temple was destroyed. And so, again, somewhat ironically, there have never been animal sacrifices in Judaism ever since that time. Animal sacrifice has disappeared as a practical issue. I'll get back to you. Okay. Within Judaism, there actually are some very conservative Jews who are hoping to rebuild the temple and bring back animal sacrifice. But so far, I don't think they'll do it because, for one thing, it would the whole Mideast would go nuclear because if they established animal sacrifice on its old site, they'd have to tear down the Dome of the Rock, which is one of the holiest shrines of Islam. So I don't think they're going to do it. So animal sacrifice, not an issue today, but it was. So we tend to lose sight of that. Now, what about Jesus? Well, the first thing we have to say is that Jesus was almost certainly a vegetarian, just from what I've already said. Because when Paul gets in this dispute with the church, there were people still alive, including James, Peter, and John, just for example, who knew Jesus while he was alive. There were many people who knew Jesus while he was alive. And if Jesus had been a meat eater, this dispute wouldn't have arisen. Because how can you say we're going to require everyone to be vegetarian? This position doesn't even make sense. If Jesus himself was a meat eater. Because then you could say, well, Jesus was a meat eater, we can eat meat. That's it. And so you wouldn't have to go through all this elaborate discussion, and you wouldn't have to tiptoe around the issue and not offend these vegetarians who seemed to include the leadership of the early church. James was a vegetarian. We believe that all the disciples were a vegetarian just from Orthodox sources. And you look at the Jewish Christian sources, we know a little about them because of the recognitions and the homilies to ancient documents, which are about the 3rd century. And Epiphanius, who writes in the 4th century. And Irenaeus also adds, I think, a couple of sentences on the Ebionites in the 2nd century. The Ebionites are the Jewish Christian group in the early church. And the Jewish Christian Ebionites were vegetarian, and they required vegetarianism. They said that Jesus was a vegetarian and that they required vegetarianism. So their gospel, for example, said that quoted Jesus as saying, "I have come to destroy the animal sacrifices, and if you don't stop sacrificing, the wrath of God will not pass from you." And on the other hand, when Jesus is offered Passover meat, he indignantly refuses to eat it. He says, "I won't have anything to do with this Passover meat." So we see the Jewish Christians have this point of view, and we see also just from the New Testament that Jesus had some major problems with animal sacrifice because Jesus actually was killed because he disrupted the animal sacrifice business in the temple. And most Christians are not even aware of this because they know of this incident by another title. They know of it as Jesus overturns the tables of the money changers. Well, it's true. There were some money changers in there, but the money changers are not the primary target of Jesus' wrath. If you look at the gospel accounts, and this incident, incidentally, is one of a few incidents that is in all 4 gospels, this incident in the temple. And I'm going to read you the one from the Gospel of John, because it's the longest and the clearest, I think. "The Passover of the Jews was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple he found those who were selling oxen and sheep and pigeons, and the money changers at their business. And making a whip of cords, he drove them all, with the sheep and oxen, out of the temple. And he poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. And he told those who sold the pigeons, 'Take these things away.'" Now, what were these people doing in the temple selling oxen and sheep and pigeons? Sacrifices. These were animals that were going to be offered in sacrifice. What Jesus was doing was disrupting the animal sacrifice business in the temple. So we can see that there's clear evidence that Jesus himself was vegetarian and taught vegetarianism in the early church. The gospel message, properly understood, includes vegetarianism and compassion for all life. Now, let's come back to the original problem, why Christianity and vegetarianism don't mix. What should we do about this? So in conclusion, I want to make 3 points. The first point is that there are a number of people, I just talked to a person about an hour and a half ago who came up to the table and said, well, I believe every word in the Bible is true and so forth. Then there are people like this. And the Christian Vegetarian Association, I think, has done a good job of taking the vegetarian message to these people and showing that even if you believe that Jesus was not a vegetarian, you could still be vegetarian yourself. The problem is that you can't be vegetarian for ethical reasons. You can't object to it, object to meat eating for ethical reasons without considerable rhetorical expertise. And basically, you can do it, but it's very awkward. And the obvious problem is, you can't condemn something that Jesus himself did if Jesus was a meat eater. So that's the first point. I think that these people should be supported, and I think that to a large extent they are being supported. Thank you, Christian Vegetarian Association. My second point, though, is that this is not what I believe. I think that vegetarianism and compassion for animals is part of the message of Jesus. That's a message which actually the world needs right now, is compassion for all animals. And I think that we ought to worry less about making the churches, the institutional church, comfortable with vegetarianism, which we certainly should do, but we should worry less about that. And we should worry more about making ethical vegetarians who want to follow the religion of Jesus comfortable wherever they are. So I would say that if you are in a church and you don't feel that this is meeting your needs or agreeing with your fundamental basic values, I'd say turn around, walk out, and don't look back. That's what I'd say. Now the third point is, my third and final point is that this is what we need. What we need is a consciousness revolution. We don't need a set of creeds. We don't need a set of beliefs. I think that it's a fundamental mistake of Christianity to tie the definition of Christianity to a beliefs, the Nicene Creed, that you are a Christian if you believe in these, dozen or so things about the supernatural or about the world beyond. I think that that's basically wrong. I don't think that God is going to judge us on the basis of what we believe about metaphysics. In fact, in the Bible, Jesus says this very thing. In Matthew 25, the people are gathered at the last judgment, and what does he say? He says, come and enter into the kingdom, because when I was thirsty, you gave me something to drink. When I was in prison, you visited me, and so forth. And he said, and the people who are being addressed saying, Lord, when did we see you thirsty? And when did we see you in prison? And Jesus says, as you did it unto the least of these, you did it unto me. The whole basis of Jesus' judgment, if we can call it that, is on what you do, not on what you believe. He never asks them what church they go to, or even if they believe in anything at all. He asks them what they do. And I think that's what the basis of Christianity should be. It should be a question of practice and not a question of belief. So that's what I would like to see. And this is a consciousness which we need to spread to the world in a very short period of time, because of the environmental crisis. The whole planet has to come to this terms. We need simple living and nonviolence. We need something like the message of Jesus. I don't care what you call it. You can call it Buddhism. You can call it something else. But it needs to be more than vegetarian. I think veganism is necessary. I think veganism is a necessary part of this message, but it's not sufficient. If we continue overpopulating the earth and driving cars and consuming then even if we're all vegans, well, our veganism will save us a few extra years, but it's not going to be enough. Veganism is a necessary but not sufficient. We need a consciousness of simple living and nonviolence as what we need to survive as a species. So, thank you. Okay. Questions?
Yeah, one quick comment and a question. Yesterday we had a historian here, Rinberry.
Yes.
He explained that the word for fish there in the 5,000 loaves of fish and all that was better translated, it's not the Ixos word, it's another word that better translated as relish. Yes. And the whole, I could probably devote an hour to this topic, but the basic thrust of his remarks is correct, that these passages are very weak. And if you look at the original manuscripts, you could say, yes, you could say that, but, but there's also an argument on the other side that it means something else. That means relish. Some of the other things you said about the other weak documents makes it pretty conclusive to me that...
That this was just, I hate to say it, but I think that somebody the Gospels all follow the letters of Paul, so they all knew about this controversy. And they were the Gentile churches were responsible at least for the final versions of these Gospels. And so, of course, they're going to want to make their followers feel that it's okay. And so Jesus did it, so it's okay. And so that's how I think basically it got in there.
Yeah. But the question I have is, what about, you haven't said much about the SDA. I think vegetarianism does mix pretty well there.
Yes, it does. I would say this about the Seventh-day Adventists, that Ellen White was, in fact, an ethical vegetarian. And she says so. But she only became an ethical vegetarian later in life. And she actually talks about the incident in the temple, in fact, where Jesus drives out the people, and she gives exactly the same interpretation that I have. So potentially, yes. The problem is that she arrived at this position after the denomination was already established, and consequently, most SDAs, not all, but most of them, I think, are vegetarians when they are vegetarian, and not all SDAs are vegetarian basically for health reasons. And this is a problem. Okay, yes?
If you look into the archives, Jesus was a sane,
yes.
Isn't a sane vegetarian?
Okay, another hour lecture, compressed into about 30 seconds. The scenes is the whole, Dr. Vaslavic here, who's also written a book, I think aptly points out that the Dead Sea Scrolls don't agree with the documents that we know as the Essene documents, namely the accounts in Philo and Josephus, which I think clearly show that they are probably vegetarian, if not actually vegetarian. Yes?
I just want to make a quick comment. If you really do believe that Jesus Christ is the Savior of the world, and he earned that status by fulfilling all of the Jewish law, no sin. So that means he observed Passover every year from the time he was 13 years old, probably from the time he was a tiny child, all the way until the time he was an adult, which means he ate the lamb which was required of the Passover service every year. That's Jewish law. And also keeping all the Jewish law that has to do with dietary allowances. So if he kept that, but bear in mind, at the end of his life, he did what in the Passover ceremony? He said, I give you a new covenant, which is the blood and the bread.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's a new covenant then which swept aside all of that.
Yeah.
And Paul writes about you're not required by the law anymore to do all that stuff. So why go back to that? Don't do that.
Right.
One final comment, and then I'm done. And that is the ideal relationship between man and animals is very clearly established in Genesis. This is the SDAs have acknowledged this, they recognize the truth of Scripture, which gives them the authority. It's not some writing of some guy at some time. It is the authority of the Bible. And as Christians, you've got to be very careful of where you're getting authority. This is not This is not just something we make up. The Bible is described as being
Right. Yeah.
holy and perfect and inspired. It's living and active. It deals with you and your relationship to the
yeah,
universe.
right. Okay. I think that people who believe this, I think, should be supported in their vegetarianism and in their religious beliefs. It's not my belief. However, first of all, the Jewish law, the question of what the Jewish law is really controversial. It was controversial in the first century, and it was controversial even today. If you talk to Richard Schwartz or people like that, you'll find that they feel, and most scholars feel, that the Passover, even in temple times, was not required for you to eat the Passover lamb. And also in the first century, there were all kinds of sects. Judaism in the first century was much more diverse today than it was, much more diverse then than it is today. You had not only the Pharisees and Sadducees, you had the Essenes, you had people like John the Baptist, who were also, according to the Ebionites at least, vegetarian. You had the Essenes. You had a number of all these different kinds of groups, all disagreeing on what the law was, all disagreeing on what the text said. The Ebionites thought there were false texts in the Old Testament, and they were good before they existed, I believe, even before Jesus. There were Nazarenes that existed before Jesus who rejected the text in the Old Testament.
They're
Okay, I think we need. Okay,
arguing over how to interpret the text.
No, they are not.
And they've compared the
Okay.
Dead Sea Scrolls and Isaiah. They've
Okay.
compared them against the modern text, and they're almost identical.
Okay, does anybody else have any questions? Yes. Okay, yes, go ahead.
You mentioned that there are a lot of Christian denominations that encourage vegetarianism, right?
Yes.
So instead of saying that it doesn't mix, why don't you just say that you think that true Christianity encourages vegetarianism? Because it obviously mixes.
Well, and that's essentially what I am saying, but the thing is that institutional Christianity and vegetarianism don't mix. Maybe I should put it that way.
And also, it was interesting when you were talking about when Jesus turned the turntables with the money changers. It was like he was symbolically stopping the animal sacrifice because he was about
Yes.
to explain and turn that over.
Yes. When Jesus went into the temple and disrupted the animal sacrifice business, he was performing an act of animal liberation. And we should not forget that. That's the basis of Christianity. And that was why he was crucified, because he was a threat to public order.
So they crucified him.
They crucified him. The reason, it wasn't the Jews who crucified Jesus, it was the Romans. And so the Romans don't care about theology. They don't care about all these different Jewish groups that don't agree with each other. If it's a threat to public order, and what did Jesus do? He went into the temple during the Passover season, which was very volatile at that time. Now, Josephus gives an account of a Roman soldier who makes an obscene gesture during the Passover. Riots break out, and it takes weeks or days to put down. So they were very sensitive to disturbances of public order. So when Jesus disrupts public order, then he's arrested, then he's crucified. Yes?
I was hoping you could offer some advice to me. So as an atheist and living I live in Fresno, in the Central Valley here in California. So I often am trying to share a message of, animal liberation and veganism with many people who are themselves Christian.
Yes?
And I find it difficult to express, my own beliefs on this subject in anything but secular ethical terms. And
That's fair enough.
Also in terms maybe of environmental concern or health. But
Yes.
I want to appeal to as many people as I can, and I want to appeal to people in a way that's familiar to them and acceptable to them, and is likely to incite a change towards veganism. But at the same time, I feel like perhaps it's misleading or condescending to give them, let's say, reasons along the lines of Christianity for being vegan or for considering animal rights, when that's something I don't believe, and In fact, I feel like that's an incomplete
Oh, don't do it.
encounter. So, I mean, do you feel like, but it, I mean, just even if they're like, I'm Christian, I can't believe in animal rights, or I can't believe in veganism because Jesus ate me, or because...
Okay. I would. Here's the thing. I wouldn't worry too much about it in your situation. What I would do is I would just talk to them about compassion. It says, I don't. We may have different beliefs, but what it's really about is about compassion. And any religion that values compassion, is something that I can support, at least to the extent that it believes in compassion. So I would just talk to them about compassion and don't even, whoops. So talk to them about compassion. Don't worry about getting into theology or anything like that.
But it's compassion for humans, right?
The thing is that, okay, they probably haven't thought about it.
Okay.
They probably haven't thought about it. They said, compassion, well, of course, I love my dog, and so I love animals, and so, just don't even worry about the Bible, because here's the thing, that Buddhists who have an explicit scripture that tells them not to take the life of any sentient creature, so the first precept of Buddhism is not to take the life of any sentient creature. Are they all vegetarians? No. Okay, there are many of them. There are, to their credit, there are probably more Buddhists that are vegetarian than Christians. But still, there are the majority of Buddhists in the United States, despite the first precept, are not vegetarian. I would be willing to bet. So the appeal, if the heart is closed, it doesn't matter what the texts say. If the heart is closed, even if you find a verse in some ancient manuscript that says, Jesus said, verily, verily, go vegan, that they still wouldn't believe it. But if the heart is open to compassion, then you don't need the scripture. And that's what the early disciples didn't have a gospel. They didn't have anything in writing. They had the message of Jesus is what they had. Okay, one more question?
Yeah, I thought Peter was a fisherman. Did he change after?
Yeah, the first thing that it says about Peter is that they left what they had behind and they followed Jesus. Yeah. Okay. Well, this has been a very fascinating discussion. I'm very glad to have you. And I'll be out there. Oh, I've written a book. Anybody want to buy my book? It's $20. Also, Charles Vaslavic has also written a book, which you can also buy. This is $20. This is $10. I'll be up here afterwards, and you can talk. Actually, probably should move out of here because the next speaker is coming. But let me go outside and.
So are all of your books for sale? I thought you said you were giving one away.
This is what I'm giving away. It's yours.
Thank you very
In
much.
fact,
I appreciate
if you want this, you can have that too.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Sure.
I'd love to take a course with you sometime.